Good afternoon from Brussels, and welcome to our distinguished speakers, our global audience, and our viewers on YouTube to this virtual event on Ukraine and pan-European security. I'm Stephen Blockmans, Director of Research at CEPS. It's my pleasure to kick this webinar off with a conversation with Javier Solana, President of ESADE Law and Business School in Madrid, former EU High Representative for Common Foreign and Security Policy, Secretary General of NATO, and Spanish Minister of Foreign Affairs, to name just a few affiliations. My colleague Zach Paikin will then take over as moderator of a panel debate in which he will present the speakers of the panel. But first, Javier, welcome back to CEPS, albeit virtually.
Great pleasure to be back. I miss you.
Javier, last week saw a series of diplomatic negotiations between Russia on the one hand, the US, NATO, the OSCE on the other, in an effort to defuse the crisis with Moscow, which some have characterized as one of the most perilous moments in Europe since the end of the Cold War. And of course, having built up a true presence of 100,000 on the eastern border with Ukraine, Russian officials pressed their demands for so-called security guarantees, including prohibiting the deployment of missiles in Europe that could strike Russia, and the placement of weaponry or troops in Eastern European states that joined NATO after the fall of the Berlin Wall. But President Putin has also demanded an end to NATO expansion, including a promise that Ukraine could never join the alliance. Now, we've of course seen that these high-level talks haven't altered perceptions that Moscow might invade Ukraine. In fact, Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov and his boss Sergei Lavrov have said that Russia sees no reason for further talks as its demands were being ignored. And in the meantime, Ukrainian government websites have already suffered a twin cyber attack that with the insertion of malware may lead to far bigger consequences than the NotPetya attack, which crippled hundreds of Ukrainian businesses and organizations in 2017, before it then spread worldwide, doing roughly damage of to the tune of 10 billion US dollars. So, and yet many in the West are left perplexed with the Kremlin's game plan. Is war coming? Is it not? Many are confused about the secrecy of the Kremlin's decision-making, of course, and the crumbs of intelligence are inconclusive. So, Javier, what do you think? What are the calculations behind Russia President Vladimir Putin's threats against Ukraine?
Well, thank you very much for your introduction. What do I think? I think we are in a very dangerous situation, and that requires the best people and the best intelligent people to look into the question with a little bit more time devoted to it, and taking into consideration the gravity of the situation. But let me start from the beginning. I think the beginning of this problem is 1999. 1999, I negotiated on behalf of NATO with Eugene Primakov at the time, the founding act whereby the NATO will start its enlargement process, and at the same time Russia will have a place in the new formation around NATO plus Russia. You remember that. Now, that was a success. The day of the summit, 3 countries were invited to enter into NATO, which was very important, the 3 of them. And another thing was very important that happened the day after. The day after, we had for the first time a meeting of NATO at the level of head of state with Ukraine. So we created the NATO-Ukraine mechanism. So that was very implicit what it meant. It meant we are opening NATO, but at the same time, with Ukraine, we do something different, which is creating a special relationship between NATO and Ukraine. Now, things go by and that begins to work. with a lot of difficulties, in particular in the NATO-Russia Council, with ambassador at the time, Kiseljak, famous ambassador later on in 2000, in a year ago. And then we have the next thing in Ukraine, there are elections. In elections that for the first time were won by Yanukovych. And we didn't like Yanukovych. I'm going to make the long story short. And we negotiated with Russia the repetition of the elections. And I was in that negotiation with Chernomyrdin, and we obtained the repetition of the election. And you remember what happened at the repetition of the election. There was not Yanukovych, but it was Yanukovych who won the elections. Therefore, it was a fantastically done diplomatically thing that gave the possibility of taking off of Ukraine on the hands of Yanukovych. Well, then we have several years with Yanukovych, with Yushchenko and Timoshenko. Big problems. Nothing happened really seriously until at the end, another elections was gone by Yanukovych. And that was the beginning of the problem. And that ended up on Maidan, and that ended up in the situation that we know very well, which is the taking over Crimea and the beginning of the conflict we have at the table. Now, what do I say this long story? Because Ukraine has been at the heart of NATO and at the heart of the European Union from the very beginning. And we have been very careful to really trying to help Ukraine very, very much, as I said from the beginning to the end. And I do think that we have to find a negotiated solution between NATO, the European Union. The European Union is fundamental as such, is in that negotiation. Russia, the United States, and eventually I will play somebody at the second level of the World Bank, of the IMF, in order to get a plan to develop Ukraine economically. This thing is not easy to talk to the Russians today on these terms. But I think we have to continue or recontinue to sit down and begin slowly and move the process forward. On the Ukraine thing, we have another bad news there. Poroshenko is in jail, which means also that something is not perfect in the Ukrainian system either. So I will recommend to keep on sending people under the table, beginning to talk and trying to find a solution that has to be, no doubt that I don't see at this moment in time a possibility of Ukraine being in NATO. I didn't see it in 2008, and I have to thank publicly to Chairman Merkel, that was the one who put the light on the table and say, well, this is very difficult to happen. Imagine if today Ukraine were in NATO and we had the same situation, we will be bound to use Article 5. And Article 5 will mean, well, you know what it means. And I don't think anybody at this time in history wants to use Article 5 in that sense. So we have to find a solution which is peaceful, which requires some sacrifices on both sides, and try to recuperate the climate that has been lost.
Yeah.
I'd like to say on the top of that I think Russia for us is a very important player. Now, imagine yourselves that we have a situation where the relationship between between the United States and China do get more complicated. We would prefer to have Russia on our side than Russia on the side of China. So it's a lot of things that may happen in the near future. And I think we have to be really very serious and take this issue very, very serious as it is. And that is what I can tell you today.
Javier, you've mainly talked about pan-European security in a way. In the meantime, of course, Mr. Putin has advanced, his tactics even further. He's positioned troops right on the border, eastern border with Ukraine. He's moving armor, heavy armor, now into Belarus. If we find, if we believe the stories that we see on social media today. So it seems that there's already a next stage of his game plan, which is developing, and one would be hard. It would be hard to avoid the conclusion after last week's talks that Putin set these talks up to fail in a way as a pretext for military maneuvers, perhaps armed intervention, on which he was bent on launching a long time ago. So.
But it's not the first time that we live with Russia, something like that. I mean, the negotiation, the procedures of negotiation of Russia are very difficult, very different from the manner we do negotiate. But remember that under Kennedy, we had a moment in which the challenge was even much, much higher than the one you have today. And it was resolved. And I don't see why we cannot resolve this one in a manner that includes the important players. And I would like to underline the importance of the European Union institutionally. For Russia, security is very important, but economics is very important. And remember that the moment in which we were negotiating economically with the European Union, with Russia, with Russia on Ukraine, economically, the Russians get very furious about that. So we need a conversation which is economically and politically, it means security. And I think that should not be impossible. And I would like to see that moving. I wouldn't like to see it because that has to be done under the table, but to begin working with the will to resolve the problem, and not only with words from one side to the other of the border.
But I wonder if that is not just placating Mr. Putin, because he seems not interested in negotiations. He will have known that any hopes of a Yalta-style carve-up of Europe into zones of interests would be futile, because the US and NATO could never agree to rule out an expansion of NATO.
But, again, the positions in front of the table it seems to be impossible, because one doesn't want to withdraw the troops and the other doesn't want to withdraw the idea of Ukraine being in NATO. Okay, we have to change the debate, and under the table try to change the debate and begin from some other steps that could lead at the solution to the real one which is on the table today. I think that diplomatically it's possible. I tell you, it's possible. That has to be done with tenacity and without doing publicly, without having to tweet every day what we do. I mean, this is not something which is going to be resolved a la Trump, Twitter, it's not. Therefore, let's try to take calm and try to open mechanisms. I think Germany has a lot to do in this, and I'm sure that the new government will take this on their hands also. But remember, do not. The member states of the European Union have to realize and understand that the European Union is fundamental in negotiation, because the economic component is also fundamental.
But as you clearly say, there should be a sequencing of formats in a way. And the EU, whilst it may have felt humiliated for not being invited to the negotiating table last week, will still have its time to negotiate in the future when economic matters come up?
You don't have to use the term humiliation. Why are we humiliated? I am not humiliated at all. I mean, let's not put all the weight on the words and the sentiments. This is it's something that has to be resolved intelligently, and knowing that everybody has to give up something. There's no way otherwise.
You talked about the role of Germany. The German foreign minister's attempts to yesterday in Ukraine, today
now in Moscow, I think today.
She is essentially trying to revive the four-party talks with France and Ukraine. Do you think that's in vain? Russia has
I think that Minsk format.
Normandy, yeah, the Normandy format.
Normandy. Well, okay, Minsk or Normandy. Normandy because the Americans are there, the Normandy one. I think that this has to be the beginning, probably. But then probably the format should be enlarged once the first steps have been taken, and try to put on the table, as I said, everything that has to be between Russia, United States, NATO, and the European Union on the table for a big, solid negotiation.
I would like to move to the question, what could stop Russia from invading Ukraine? It seems that having learned from the Obama administration's, some say, too mild response in 2014, when Russian troops annexed Ukraine, invaded Donbass, the US has now, in a rare move, been detailing the cost of Russia's invasion prior to last week's high-level talks. It is said that it would cut off Russian financial institutions from the SWIFT international payment system.
This is I mean, to take Russia out of SWIFT is a threat which is it's an exaggeration. This is you can maintain it as a threat, but it's very difficult to take it to reality. You kill a country economically. So play with it, but knowing that you are playing as Russia is playing with the troops. They're playing with what you have, which is SWIFT. And okay, use it, but you know that you will never use it all the way to the end. And
what about the other sanctions? What about the other sanctions which the US has proposed, imposing other secondary sanctions on Russian industry?
The most difficult moments with Iran. You remember there was thought to use SWIFT. You remember probably it was moment. Of course, it was not. It's not used because that is a tremendous disturbance in the global economy.
What about blocking Russia from pumping gas through Nord Stream 2, the pipeline to Germany?
But that is a much more reasonable thing. But you don't have to define what is going to be the definite status of the Nord Stream. But I mean, let's not start Nord Stream without saying that you're going to stop it forever. But I mean, this is what is diplomacy about. This is the type of thing that an intelligent negotiator has to do.
And it's interesting that you say that, also in connection with Germany, of course. I mean, there's an energy-hungry EU, Germany in particular, begs the question whether they would follow the US if the US would indeed adopt extraterritorial sanctions. And to the extent that they would, what would it entail for EU-Russia relations going forward? As indeed for the contested neighborhood, Ukraine in particular.
That's why I think that it's not a negotiation of Russia with the United States. This is part of the negotiation, but it cannot be the full negotiation. The negotiation has to be with the European Union on the table. And not only a couple of countries, some institutionalized position of the European Union has to be there. I mean, I remember again, here is security, But don't forget that it's the economy also. Russia doesn't want Ukraine economically out of the Russian relationship. And remember that was very important in all the negotiations. Ask whoever negotiated with Russia. On Ukraine, the economic part is very important. The most important economic part of the Soviet Union at a given moment was Ukraine. The eastern part of Ukraine is a very fundamental part of the economy of the Soviet Union. So it's very, very important that the economy is economics is placed into the negotiation. And I think another idea that another questions I would put on the table eventually is the World Bank or the plan for economic help to Ukraine.
You talk long term. We're in an acute situation of crisis, of course, and I'm wondering whether Germany, as a pivotal member state, would indeed follow a US lead in adopting sanctions.
It seems to me that the Chancellor is planning to go to Moscow soon, or used to be planning. I don't know if he has changed his mind, but this is the type of thing that is necessary. It's absurd not to talk when the moments are difficult. When the moments are difficult, you have to talk. You have to talk under the table, or you have to go. You cannot say like two kids and say, "Well, I don't talk to you." No, I have to talk to you because we have a problem, and it's a very serious problem.
Do you think that listing the type of sanctions that the US would impose on Russia in case of an invasion in Ukraine was a mistake? Because now basically Putin can use this.
Very difficult to know, but I mean, he simply not responding to the military movement on the other side. I think we can take a more serious and not a bluffing type of thing, and try to maintain the doors open. Try to keep on talking. I mean, we are talking now in a think tank. We cannot. We will not be talking like that if we were in office. You know? I mean, I would not talk like this if I were in office, because I can't. But what we are talking about to do, without saying it, is what has to be done.
Mm. But do you think that Putin now, with the list of the US in his hand, can further sanction-proof Russia and weaken Western threats in the future?
I don't believe in that idea that because we accept an agreement with Russia today, because they were troops tomorrow, they will put more things, and we will be defeated forever. This is not nonsense. It is nonsense. I mean, you may use negotiation in a certain manner today, and tomorrow it will be opposite. The opposite, I mean, we will be the ones who press, maybe. I mean,
so I think
we are playing with very serious things as we didn't believe that it may be true.
And as Europeans, we should not be lured into a zero-sum political game.
No.
Yeah.
But now, imagine that you decided to use the phrase, why don't we think about a new mechanism of security in Europe? But remember that the security in Europe has changed since 1945 several times. We invented the OSCE, very important element for this tension between Russia and the United States. So look a little bit to history also. The point is that we are looking at the history of 40 years, and now we are talking to the history in 3 months or 4 years or 5 years. No? But it is time maybe to rethink the whole scheme of security in Europe.
Okay.
I think, for instance, that the falling of the Soviet Union, the breaking of the Soviet Union, plus a European Union which is stronger, requires a little bit of thinking.
So would you go as far as to suggest that the West would need its own great plans to think about pan-European security and might even consider offering Russia a NATO membership? I mean, Putin wouldn't.
I don't want to talk about anything in specific, because whatever you say, you kill it. But there's a lot of ideas that can be placed. Some ideas that can be pushed into a table in which you agree that you want to talk, and the other part agrees that wants to talk.
Yeah.
Now, without you cannot say again that Ukraine will never be in NATO. Maybe you shouldn't repeat that, but you don't have to cancel that either. You can have the capacity to explain what does it mean. We are not in public, but we are almost in public. But there are 2 or 3 things that come to your mind, because I know you are very intelligent. You understand what the conversation is going.
I'm just wondering whether an offer that Putin might refuse might still talk to Russian citizens and successors of Putin, which would be pleased with amiable.
That's another story. What is Putin is not going to be everlasting, but still we have a certain time in which we have to live with Putin.
That's right. In the meantime, we have to build up our own strategic autonomy, our own strategic gas reserves in the European Union. But the European Union as a peace project that has benefited so long from its soft power seems to have been robbed of that soft power. Is it dead, in fact, soft power, in your view?
Don't forget, the European Union was born to prevent war. Okay? Well, we have to maintain that, to maintain the principles in which we have been created. And the neighbors at that time were different. We had the Soviet Union, but we have Russia now. And the problem is the neighborhood of Russia. But that shouldn't be more difficult than the Soviet Union.
In the end, we are interested in a strong Ukraine, a Ukraine that is democratic and economically vibrant, and that might serve as a source of inspiration for Russian citizens to reform their own state.
Let me tell you that you have to talk very frankly to Ukraine also. Ukraine, remember, we did for Ukraine the most important thing in 2004. We did to Ukraine during that period. We have sustained in Ukraine and having every year a meeting, a very important meeting in Crimea. Remember, every single year. So we have been accompanied Ukraine very much. The stability of Ukraine is not perfect, and we have to recognize that. And they have to make an effort also to really move their country forward also.
Javier Solana, thank you so much for joining us at this stage. I hope we can.
Very much. I'm sorry that we cannot talk more openly because the situation doesn't allow that to do it. But please keep on talking, keep on talking, keep on talking.
Thank you very much. Please do stick around if you can. But we
yes,
will.
I will. I have to listen to the criticism that they would make to me.
Very good. We will turn over now to Zach Piken, who will moderate the panel session. Thank you very much, Javier.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you very much, Javier Solana, for your insights this afternoon. Good afternoon to our audience. My name is Zach Piken. I'm a researcher in the EU Foreign Policy Unit here at CEPS in Brussels. And to unpack this issue a little bit further, we are very grateful to have with us today 3 excellent panelists. First of all, joining us from Aalen in Baden-Württemberg, we have Roderick Kiesewetter, He's a member of the German Bundestag, as well as the representative of foreign affairs for the CDU and CSU caucus. Thank you so much for joining us, Roderich. We have as well Maria Shagina, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Zurich, as well as a visiting research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki. Thank you for joining us today, Maria. And finally, last but not least, Vladimir Ishenko, who is a postdoctoral research associate at the Institute of East European Studies at the Freie Universität Berlin, who is joining us today from Dresden. A reminder to all of our audience that you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of our screen, your screen, over the course of the next hour to ask your questions, and we will try our best to get to as many of those as possible. In the meantime, I would like to start with Roderich, an opening question to you. More than 30 years ago, we were talking about a Europe whole and free, and yet now we appear to be possibly on the brink of war in Europe. So how did we get here exactly? And was the current crisis that we're living through right now inevitable?
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. I really feel honored, and also my gratitude to the Center of European Policy Studies, a real pillar for mutual understanding and exchange of views, and a threshold also for democracy and freedom. I thank you so much. Yes, this is really a key question, but I want to be brief. When we were at the end of the Cold War, we were not naive, but we were full of outlook and perspective. At that time, we tried to create structures, and it was Manfred Wörner, one of the predecessors of Javier Solana, who mentioned at the very beginning of the widening of NATO and European Union that we need to create a forum for exchange with Russia. So he was one of the fathers of the idea for the NATO-Russia Council. Due to the fact that German unification was not only supported by the United States, but also by Russia, Gorbachev, and the foreign minister Shevardnadze, who later on, as the prime minister and president of Georgia, asked for NATO membership of Georgia. So at that time already it was clear that within Europe, Russian troops have stood until 2004, until 1994. And I myself have experienced Russian troops in Eastern Germany when I was there for the buildup for German unification. But it was an atmosphere of mutual understanding, and we lost this. And we lost this also due to the development in the 90s. We needed investment security for the new Middle Eastern European countries. And this investment security was combined with a membership in the European Union. And at that time, Russia had a quite weak leadership, and Putin was the answer of this weak leadership. And we missed a chance when he talked in 2001 to the German Bundestag in an excellent speech. And in 2007, I was a witness of his speech at the Munich Security Conference, and I could look from upon his speech, and more than 1/3 of every page was overwritten by his handwritten remarks. So it was his personal expression of his concerns. So what has happened between 2001 and 2007? There was a false war in Iraq. There was a pressure from the United States and a division of Europe into into an old and into a modern Europe. And Germany and France were part of this old Europe. And at that time, at least, we should have started a process to convince transatlantically for a better exchange with Russia. We missed this chance. And at the end, Russia confronted us with a violation of the Charter of Paris. And we had in 2007 the cyber war against Estonia, 2008, the split of Georgia, and then in 2014, the problems we have today with the violation of the Budapest Agreement. So we lost the time between 2001 and 2007 to create an own strong European voice. I believe that one of the main origin is that we missed the possibility to create more European cohesion. And I plea that to overcome this, it will not help if Macron, Scholz, Baerbock, Le Drian, and others travel to Russia. What we need is a combined European approach. We need a coercive and consensus-oriented European endeavor to include the different positions of Austria, Italy, and Netherlands on the one side, who are quite open-minded towards Russia. And we have to balance this with the security concerns of the Visegrad and Baltic states. And as a German, I see these security concerns of the Baltic states and Visegrad states. And prior to any progress with Ukraine and Russia, we need a balanced approach to include the problems and challenges which the Baltic states are faced in their airspace and other issues. So we need a better understanding inside Europe for the challenges at our eastern border. And this, I see, is the task of Germany. Merkel was very keen to balance this, but on the other side, with the Nord Stream 2, we isolated us in Germany from the European, not only from the European energy project, but also from a European common endeavor. It was a specific German way, a Sonderweg, which was not helpful. And so it made it very easy for Putin to divide and split the cohesive endeavor of the European Union. So the way out is diplomacy and trade on the one side, but on the other side, a military credible deterrence and the willingness to cooperate, I conclude, in 3 steps, not to rule out military weaponization of Ukraine if a certain certain barrier is Russia has made a progress in a certain manner, and second, we need to put on SWIFT. We should not rule out the SWIFT regulations to exclude Russia, and third, we need Nord Stream 2 also as an instrument so that energy is not used as a weapon against Europe. With these 3 issues, we could then offer to Russia more trust-building measures in armaments question and a program to renew their energy infrastructure regarding global warming and the question of green hydrogen. But this must be at the end of the process and not as proposed today at the beginning of the process. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much for helping us unpack that. Let's get back to fundamentals first and then unpack potential solutions and the question of EU unity a little bit later in the panel. My next question to Maria, which is, in your view, what are the primary drivers of Russia's push to obtain security guarantees right now? And should we take Moscow at its word that it is genuinely concerned about NATO expansion, or is this really about something else?
Yes, I think it's agree with Mr. Kizilbet, a very strong statement, and some aspects which I can underline as well, that while the EU had its own perception of Russia and didn't change in great extent, Russia's perception of Russia has changed, and quite rightly so, quite strongly so, over the past few months after Angela Merkel departed. And one can argue that while the US is being preoccupied with China and trying to put Russia in some sort of box and establish stable and predictable relationship, EU has this sort of vacuum of power, if you want, with Germany is trying to form a new coalition government. So there is some, work going on in Berlin in defining new foreign policy towards Russia. And one can argue that this moment, from the Western perspective, was used by Russia to escalate. There are also developments in Ukraine itself, how it proceeded against the pro-Russian oligarchs in Ukraine. Viktor Medvedchuk is known as a Russian man in Kiev. It was sanctioned by President Zelensky, so that definitely also spiraled what is happening. And also the talks between Russian and Ukrainians has basically been halted. So there is not much going on, and Russia has used that. The second part of your question, whether that was, pretext for escalation, I think at this point, during the talks that we saw last week, it was important to have the talks. Obviously, dialogue should be there to not to resort to arms as the first option, but at the same time, I think the irony is that we don't know exactly what the one person in Kremlin will decide, and this uncertainty is very disturbing for us.
Understood. Thanks very much for that. And I'd like to pick up on what you were just mentioning concerning some of Ukraine's domestic challenges right now and pose a question to Vladimir. One of the European Union's 5 guiding principles for its relations with Russia has been to pursue closer relations with former Soviet states. And yet you're seeing right now, despite years of a profound form of integration between the European Union and Ukraine, embodied perhaps most clearly in the association agreement and the DCFTA that the EU and Ukraine have signed. Nonetheless, there are some significant domestic challenges remaining in Ukraine today. Most, I wouldn't say necessarily most notably, but most recently notably, we've seen President Zelensky taking on not just Medvedchuk, but also former President Poroshenko, as well as Renata Akhmetov. Taking this all into account, I'm wondering if you could help our audience understand, in your view, to what extent Ukraine is capable of modernizing in line with European norms. And with hindsight, do you think that the EU's strategy for advocating for deeper integration of Ukraine into the EU regulatory orbit, if that has been a successful strategy or a right-headed strategy for the European Union to adopt?
Thank you, Zachary. These are huge questions, actually, but thank you for raising the issue of escalating attacks on the opposition in Ukraine. That's especially escalated in the last year, and not only on Medvedchuk, although, yeah, he was presented as a pro-Russian oligarch. That is like part of the truth. Another part of the truth that when Zelensky imposed sanctions on him, his party was scoring the first place in the national representative poll. So it was the most popular party at that certain moment. And now it's Poroshenko. So what Zelensky, when he came to power in 2019, it appeared that he has a huge support from the society, at least as hope against the old politics, against Poroshenko, against his nationalism, against the oligarchy, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, he didn't have any real party. His People's Servant was created from scratch in 2 months. He didn't have any populist movement behind him. And as it appeared in a few months, he didn't even have a coherent team behind him. And his first government was dismissed in just half a year. His first chief of staff was dismissed about the same time. And then there was kind of like a chaotic replacing of the people in the government, probably most frequently as ever in the modern Ukrainian politics. So what Zelensky is now desperately trying to do is to rebuild a kind of patronal, competitive authoritarian regime, as political scientists like to call them, quite typical for Soviet states, but at the same time having not so much organizational resources for this, and in a way kind of like maneuvering, balancing, and being pushed from different sides by the actors who have actually serious power in the Ukrainian society. These are various oligarchic groups. Akhmetov is probably one of the most important of them. This is the mobilized national liberal civil society, where the nationalist part may use the force of arms and threaten the government, and the liberal part relies on the push from the Western partners of Ukraine, United States, European Union, IMF, and to push the government to follow their own agenda. And Zelensky is a kind of like in this cage, desperately trying to build some kind of a coherent structure, but of course it's quite far from liberal democracy in whatever sense you may wish to use this term.
Thank you very much for those insights. Let's shift now to the question of EU-Russia relations more specifically. Rodrigues, the European Union now finds itself in a position of begging to be included in security talks on the future of European security. Here we are 30 years now after the Maastricht Treaty, and still the European Union needs to come cap in hand to Washington and to Moscow to be included in negotiations on the future of security on their own continent. You know, this past year, we saw the EU unveil an Indo-Pacific strategy. I'm wondering how you could think that the EU could even have such significant ambitions to project power and autonomous power into other global theaters when it still can't even demonstrate a degree of actorness in its own neighborhood on high-level issues like this.
Yeah, this is a very difficult question, but I believe it's to the point, because as we see, the European Union is focused on itself regarding the new Green Deal, which is very exclusive and not handling countries like Bosnia, Kosovo, or Algeria and Libya, who are carbonized countries, how to include them. So cooperation with the European Union is interlinked with the question of decarbonization, which I believe is wrong for those countries who might be then at the interest of Russia, of China, or others. Second remark, I believe that the question of decarbonization and Green Deal is overlaying the question of common security. So it is a kind of a new realm of European engagement by neglecting that internationally only strong and cohesive organizations are accepted. And therefore, I believe we need a combination. The new government tries to combine this with the question of climate foreign policy, but it is not emphasizing also on the same weight the question of a credible security. And this leads in the Eastern European countries to a development to closer cooperate with the United States. As long as Biden is the president of the United States, this might not cause a problem because Biden is a clear transatlanticist. So is Borrell and Mrs. von der Leyen. But if Trump comes again in office, then the European approach will be exploited by the United States, and we will be isolated much more. So our idea must be, yes, we should cooperate with Russia and Ukraine in energy questions, and we are responsible for the energy security of Ukraine. I believe this must be one of the aims. And as it was mentioned, I believe by Stephen in the beginning, what we need is also that the cooperation of Russia, our responsibility for Ukraine as a role model, and Javier Solana has mentioned it as well, to create a Ukraine which is competitive to Russia and is a role model also for Russian citizens, that they would like to live like people live in Ukraine as regards freedom, welfare, and so on, and standards. This must be our aim, to stabilize Ukraine and fight against corruption and organized crime and so on. So if we agree on this, the main focus could not be to decarbonize Europe. This could be one of the tasks. The main task must be to provide security inside Europe and to create third-party agreements with the United Kingdom, with Ukraine, with the Balkan states, and probably with some states in the MENA region, so that with third-party arrangements, we provide security. And in a further step, then we could provide energy security and something like that. But all goes together with credible security and credible deterrence. And then we are able to negotiate in a balanced approach, and also for Russia in a credible manner, that we are accepted as equal and sit at the table as three, or as a table, Europeans combined with a transatlantic approach together with Russia. But as now we are separated and isolated, and that's wrong.
Right now, and now, Maria, over the past 8 years, we have seen, part of the reason perhaps why we've seen the isolation of the European Union is that both the EU and Russia in the relations of the course of the past several years have basically been talking past each other, right? The EU has been content to reiterate its principles, Russia has reiterated its grievances, and both sides have appeared very prepared to live with a messy status quo of sorts. Is that a durable state of affairs in your perspective?
Well, the politics of, balancing containment and engagement is not just characteristics for Europe, but also for the US. But with the current escalation, the room for maneuver for engagement is getting smaller and smaller. And also, given taken into account that for Russia to engage in those which can be seen as benevolent topics like climate change would not be cost-free. There will be an attempt to capitalize on this cooperation to get some benefits in other areas. So this is the sad status quo we're in, and I don't see any better strategy for the moment apart from attending mixed messages and not reading them well.
Understood. We'd like to bring Javier Solana back into the discussion right now. I'm wondering if you'd like to share your thoughts on some of what you've heard so far. And you're on mute, Mr. Solana. You have to unmute yourself. Perhaps while you're doing that, let's bring in Vladimir just for. Oh, there we go. Now we can hear you.
No, I don't have but to agree with what everything has said. Now, I think the ideas are getting more clear than yesterday. Today, this conversation is more sophisticated than the conversation of the day before yesterday, I think. I mean, the representative from the CDU has spoken in a manner which is very understandable and I think very, very constructive in the sense that we have to respect what we have to respect, which everybody knows. Now, they put it into the table energy is a very interesting topic. I don't know if to put it today or to put it the day after tomorrow. But in any case, it's a topic which is of great interest for Russia, for Ukraine, and for us. So I think it's an intelligent point to have in mind that the European Union has other things to put on the table. Very interesting. Now, the other thing is which I think is very interesting is that you have recognized that Ukraine has to give a sentiment to the friends, which is not somebody we're helping because for charity, because we want a country which is a serious country. And I have the sentiment that at the end of the day, we don't believe that. We don't believe that Ukraine has the capability with this crisis to create himself a country economically viable. Now, this is one of the problems that I have always, and I tell you, I was with Ukraine since being in Ukraine. I think I was the first person that went to Ukraine, and I never left them. But really, I have not seen that vibrancy of somebody who wants to be helped up to military action without doing their part. I don't want to offend any Ukrainians. I mean, no Ukrainian will be offended by me because they know how much I've done for them. But it is true that we have also to push them a little bit. And again, with the discussion that you have had, I think that came out some light of directions in which we could move on. I mean, it's not only the situation of today. We have to break this blockade. But once this blockade is broken, there are many, many, many things that can be intelligently placed. And I think the presence of the European Union is a new asset that can be placed to the table. For instance, energy. For many other things, maybe chips, or maybe some other things that we can do together. So,
now, your comments on Ukraine actually represent an excellent segue into a question for Vladimir, which is that so much of today's dispute between Russia and the West has centered on the notion that Ukraine has the right to choose its alliances or its orientation, etc. I'm wondering if you think that this is a viable principle on which Europe's security system can actually be based. And indeed, is it a viable principle for a country with a population as diverse as that of Ukraine?
Let me answer that question. In NATO membership is to bring to the organization contributions, not problems, solutions. So we invite people to get into NATO because they bring some solution if the problem comes. But we should not get invited to NATO countries that would be a problem, a serious problem. So the other mechanism to help them to resolve that problem, which is not membership. And that's what we did in 1999. When we had the first enlargement summit, and I would chair that meeting. The following day, I chaired a meeting with Clinton, with everybody, with Kuchma, that at that time, Kuchma was the president of Ukraine, the very same day. More clear we couldn't be about our respect for Ukraine. The very same day that we opened NATO to 3 countries, we established a mechanism for helping Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia and vis-a-vis NATO. So I think that we had a very good scheme to work, and that has been destroyed for responsibilities of everybody. Putin arrived, was not Yeltsin, was Putin. The first thing was done with Yeltsin and Putin, but then also what somebody has said, that from the 2000 and from the Bush, from September 11, from the 21st century, the question of Russia, etc., was dominated by terrorism, was dominated by Iraq, was dominated by Afghanistan, was dominated by so many other things, that we didn't pay the attention that was required to somebody that don't forget. When President Bush looked at his eyes, he said, I saw a good person at the other side. And that was when Putin said, I am a New Yorker. That was Putin said at the day of September 11. So we could have constructed on that, but we were not able to. We didn't know how to do it, and the other direction of American security dominated the picture.
Vladimir, perhaps you can focus a little bit on the domestic version of this question. Basically, what do the domestic divisions within Ukraine identity-based divisions, political divisions of other sorts, what do they tell us about the viability of Ukraine being a part of a Western-led security system?
Thank you. And yes, this is the question I think that is very much underestimated in the ongoing discussions. And it is quite frequently assumed that Ukraine is something, some unified entity. And I don't mean that Ukraine is somehow like irreparably divided, or it's not even like a real state as Putin alleges. It's just a normal country with different diverse political positions. And there are Ukrainians which are pro-NATO, there are Ukrainians which are not for NATO. And this balance has been actually changing a lot. So if you look at the history, Ukraine was actually founded as a non-bloc neutral state that was inscribed into the Declaration of the Sovereignty. It was inscribed into the first constitution of Ukraine. And yes, Javier Solana reminded us, in the beginning, NATO was expanding, but for Ukraine, it was a very specific partnership. And Ukraine was doing kind of like what was called a multi-vector policies between EU and NATO on the one side and Russia on the other side, but trying to retain this non-bloc status. Then when the NATO started to be really seriously discussed, it was after the Orange Revolution, and this issue was pushed by George W. Bush. And so we should also understand that this was a part of the same process that brought the disasters to Afghanistan and to Iraq. And on the eve of the Bucharest summit, support for NATO domestically in Ukraine was below 20%. Most of Ukrainians were actually split between retaining the neutral status and joining the military alliance with Russia. Now, after 2014, this changed, and supporters of Russia are now in a small minority, but the support for NATO increased, but it didn't turn into anything like a stable majority or consensual position within Ukraine. So there is still something like 40–50% of those who would support NATO as the best security option for Ukraine, but there is also a very large minority of those who would say that no, staying in the non-bloc neutral position would be still best for Ukraine, because we don't want even more tensions with Russia. We don't want to increase even more tensions between Ukrainians. And we don't really want to get into something like Afghanistan together in the US-led coalition. So since 2019, support for NATO increased in Ukraine, but because of the two things. Zelensky was a popular president who campaigned for NATO. And in the last year, we saw two waves of the Russia buildups, which actually scared part of Ukrainian population. But the question is to which extent these trends would be sustainable, or it is just a spike in the polls, and next year after negotiations would hopefully be successful, and when the crisis would be overcome, we would see again something like 40% for NATO, with a large group of Ukrainians either undecided or supporting the non-bloc position. So politically, of course, the question of NATO-Ukraine relations should be decided between NATO and Ukraine. But when we speak Ukraine, we should mean like all Ukrainians, with all the diversity of the positions that should be negotiated in somehow in a political process within Ukraine, where one of the positions is not stigmatized as pro-Russian, as anti-Ukrainian, anti-patriotic, as it has been actually since 2014 and since the Euromaidan revolution, which legitimizes the suppression of a large oppositional segment within Ukrainian society. So if all Ukrainians decide, and this should, ideally, this should also include those Ukrainian citizens who live in Donbass and who live in Russia annexed Crimea. They may get Russian passports, but these are several millions of Ukrainian passport holders. And if we speak about democracy, we all, as a Ukrainian nation, should get into some political process and decide where we should go. Before this would be hardly a more democratic decision, not more democratic as that great Yalta replay that Putin wants.
Understood. Roderick, over to you on the question of the Minsk agreements in particular. European leaders have often intimated that the responsibility for implementing the Minsk agreements primarily lies with Russia, because that implementation, or the full implementation, as is often said, is viewed as a precondition to the restoration of business as usual between the EU and Russia. But with hindsight now, I'm wondering if you think it would have been more beneficial for the EU to place more pressure on Ukraine to implement those agreements, given how politically unpopular they are within Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. I believe we need a two-folded approach, but because on the other side, Russia is avoiding the negotiation table. They are bringing forward the representatives of Donetsk and Luhansk, and so there is an indirect influence of Russia, directly desired from Russia, so that they could abstain. So what we need to reach is at least that Russia is taking place at the negotiation table together with Ukraine. This must be the first step. And second, if we want to include the OSCE, there is a great unanimous conviction that the OSCE troops might resolve that. Then it's the question, where should they be posted? So it could not be only at the contact line. They need to be present in the whole eastern Ukraine, and there Russia is against. So we have some room for negotiation, but first condition is, if there is any condition, that Russia must come back to the table. On the other side, Ukraine has to push through its reforms. So they cannot excuse themselves not to start the reforms due to the occupation. They need to show also to the interested public in the European Union that they are willing for reforms. And with these two very small conditions, I think the process could start again.
Gotcha. A little follow-up for you on Germany in particular. I'm wondering, in your view, how much you think that Germany's defense of Nord Stream 2 has led to European disunity and therefore has prevented the European Union from becoming a united strategic actor that could actually be invited to the table in the context of the security talks that we're seeing right now. And not only has there been, the defense of Nord Stream 2 over the past several years by the previous German government, certainly, as well as the current one, which seems a little bit more confused on this issue, but you also see the current government refusing to supply Ukraine, even with defensive weapons, in the context of a heightened, security tensions. So, given both of those factors, what levers of hard power does the EU even have at its disposal right now, given the way that Germany has positioned itself over the past few years?
Well, there's a lot of gratitude to France from those who opposed Nord Stream 2 inside Germany, that France has created some pressure on the last German government, my party, to achieve the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. And this Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, which has also a defense clause in it, mutual defense, was only possible because of a change in the German attitude, so that we opened the Nord Stream 2 realm also for the Baltic states, for Ukraine, and so on, so that we Europeanized the Nord Stream 2 arrangement. It is one of the strange secrets of the last 16 years, why our politicians, be it from the SPD, who is the originator, Schröder, or also the CDU, named and created a reputation of Nord Stream 2 as a private economic project. This was wrong from the scratch, and I believe that historians have to find out what was the reason. The normal period in the parliament lasts 4 years, but Chancellor Schröder has shortened this period in 2005 by 1 year. It should last until 2006. And in 2005 already, he changed into Russian services of Gazprom by taking over the chairmanship of the board. So this was a real political sign. And I think it damaged the German reputation that we formed this project or created a project with a pure and single economic focus. This was wrong, and it created mistrust in the Baltic states, in Ukraine, and so on. This was healed in the last 3 years by the pressure also from Norbert Röttgen, from Johann Wadefuhl, from me. We three politicians urged the government to change the attitude, but without France, this would, and the pressure from Poland and Ukraine, this would have failed. So to cut a long story short, I believe now Germany has learned, but the new chancellor just last week mentioned it's a private project, a private economic project. I only can plead that not only we parliamentarians, but also a think tank like yours, that elder statesmen like Javier and scientists like here on the board, on the panel, that we keep the pressure that Germany becomes honest and treats this project what it is, as an energy project which needs to be lifted on the European level and which must be seen as a geopolitical and geo-economic project.
Thanks very much for that very frank response. Javier wanted to jump in. Yes, go ahead.
I want to agree with that statement at the end. I think that it was privatized, quotation mark, because we all thought, and I include myself at that time, that it would be less conflicted. But at the end of the day, it turned out that it's more conflicting to have it privatized than to have it maintained as a national European project. That would be, I think, a good step to my mind into calming down other countries which have suspicions about Nord Stream. But the fact that Israel was the president is not, it didn't help much either. No.
Okay, let's, in the final 20 minutes that we've got here, we've focused a little bit on the past so far. Let's focus now on the future. Maria, over the past 8 years, it looks as if sanctions have failed to deter Russia, to say the least. If anything, Russia appears to be more of a problem for the EU and for the West today than it was 8 years ago. So going forward in this crisis and beyond as well, to what extent are sanctions actually a viable tool for the European Union to use to manage its relationship with Russia? So again, both in the context of the current crisis over Ukraine, but also moving forward.
I'm afraid whether you like sanctions or don't, they are the key deterrent right now in the EU's toolbox. And if we go back 8 years ago, one can argue that have failed to achieve the ultimate goal to change Russia's behavior towards Ukraine. But there are other dimensions to what sanctions had achieved back then 8 years ago. And it's important, even though it might seem like untangible idea, but it was important signaling about international norms and rules for Ukraine in particular, but also to other third countries that might be tempted to engage in some sort of adventures internationally. They also constrained Russia's maneuver back then around 2015 around Mariupol that could potentially be invaded by the Russian forces. That this is counterfactual, we cannot prove it, and this is the downside of arguing about this aspect of sanctions, but this can be taken as a valid argument. Sanctions on the macroeconomic level, if you look at Russia's economy, you see fortress Russia is going ahead, nothing seems to stop it. You have low debt levels, ample international reserves, one of the largest internationally, around 600 billion, I think the latest data that I saw. It's also a very conservative policy that bodes well with Russia's state of mind, not to spend it, to preserve it. But this stability doesn't come free, right? It comes at the cost of economic growth, and that comes at a cost for ordinary Russians who didn't see economic growth over the past 8 years. And in fact, whereas globally economies grew around 3%, in the world, Russian economy grew below 1%, 0.8, something like this. And one can argue this was not a factor of sanctions that prevented this, was the drop in price of oil, rightly so. IMF says so in its study. But it would be, simplistic to say that sanctions can collapse the economy overnight, and here we are, have this magic bullet. Sanctions don't work like this, and they increase costs here and there on the margins. And this is what they have done for sanctions companies, for even non-sanctioned companies who have troubles raising Western capitals and have to pivot to other countries like China. At the same time, China is still not providing the most favorable interest rates. It capitalizes on Russia's isolation. So while one can argue that Russia has adapted to a certain extent and in certain areas, not everywhere, this adaptation is also not free. It comes at a certain cost where certain costs, and over the long term, the sanctions we have now at the table are not light sanctions. They are much harder sanctions options, and this is what we can assess then in the future. And the problems for the EU now, because the sanctions are not low costs, it comes with consideration where the EU is ready to carry this cost, to carry the burden of sanctions. The discussion I see now is all about Russia's retaliations, fear of inflicting self-pain, And this is unfortunately the inevitable, because one can argue we didn't push hard enough in 2014. Now the way forward is only harsher sanctions. This is the only tool we can have. We can expand statecraft in general, not just sanctions, but can use export controls, investment screening. Sanctions will still be the key part of this deterrence.
Understood, Maria, but there is the argument as well that excessive sanctions in the context of an incursion into Ukraine, which of course would have to be severe, especially if it's the only tool that you said, or at least the major tool that the EU has in its toolbox, such sanctions could basically end Russia's relationship with the West as we know it and result in Russia being extremely dependent on China, both economically and geostrategically. So I'm wondering, in your view, what is a more important strategic interest for the European Union? Is it to punish Russia for its actions, or is it to leave open some sort of space for Russia to have a place in Europe over the long term?
The current sanctions we're talking about is not about coercion. Those are not the sanctions that were in 2014. These are sanctions about deterrence, to prevent Russia to invade to Ukraine. And this has a slightly different objective, slightly different tool in its nature. One can argue that Russia has pivoted to China excessively over the past 8 years, but their relationships should also be taken with a pinch of salt. There is still a lingering mistrust between the two. Even though two countries have created their alternatives to Western financial infrastructure, they don't cooperate. And there are plenty of examples where they don't cooperate because they don't trust each other. They want to preserve their own sovereignty. And this is a key word for both of them. They want to preserve this autonomy for maneuver. So we should not exaggerate to what extent they will cooperate. Obviously, we should not underestimate. They want to, they like to portray themselves as strong brothers in arms, but there are problems. But at the end of the day, Russia's economy is strongly linked to Europe, not to China. If we take energy, Russia ships piped gas more in terms of LNG, but piped gas is only 12 BCM versus around 200 BCM to Europe. So we cannot say that overnight Russia will substitute the European economy for the Chinese one.
Gotcha. Javier, in your view, do you think this is the end of the 5 principles as we know them, right? We've known that since the beginning of the Ukraine crisis 8 years ago, the EU's relationship has been based on the Mogherini 5 principles, which have been criticized left and right. To some extent, some of them embody only the lowest common denominator. They have failed to really come up with a viable alternative to the greater Europe from Lisbon to Vladivostok vision that prevailed for the bulk of the post-Cold War period. So in your view, is this the end of that paradigm for the EU's relationship with Russia as a result of this crisis?
Well, I hope it's not. I mean, of course, it's a big blow to the relations. But as Maria has been talking, the question of China, Russia is a question which is open, and we can help it to go in a direction or the other. And I think for us, Russia is part of our geography. Russia is going to be in our side for forever. So it's a difficult country. Yes, it has been always a difficult country. It's a very special country. Yes, it is. But it's part of our continent, and they should be part of our communality, at least economically. And I think that the economic component. I mean, Marie has not mentioned demography, but the question of demography in Russia is very dramatic, and that is very much linked to the future economy. So it's a lot of things potentially that can go wrong in Russia, and they may need help from their old friends in the European Union.
Gotcha. Vladimir, from your perspective, I'm wondering if you could help us understand, number one, how can the EU, in your view, based on your knowledge of Ukraine, best contribute to a stable Ukraine that itself is the linchpin of a stable European security system? And number two, what can Ukraine and the Ukrainian government best do to contribute to stability in Europe right now?
I think one of the most important issues that the European Union should communicate to Ukraine is that Ukraine needs to recognize its own political diversity, that it is a diverse country, that Ukrainians may be pro-NATO and anti-NATO, they may be pro-EU and maybe Eurosceptic, they may be they may have different economic positions, may support various humanitarian and cultural policies, but they are still the part of the same nation. So despite of that rhetoric that Euromaidan unified the nation and created some kind of like new civic inclusive Ukrainian nation, that actually didn't come true. Euromaidan was a deficient revolution. It didn't unify the nation, but it actually projected an image of a unified nation where like everyone who didn't unify is somehow became excluded from the political process, and this is an obvious democratic deficiency. So European Union should communicate that Ukraine should also change itself in this direction too. And this is at the same time, this is a ground for implementing the Minsk Accords, because one of the most important factors why it is not implemented, because it would be a capitulation for very specific nation building project for Ukraine, which is fundamentally built on seeing Russia as an ultimate other, against which Ukrainians define themselves. And there are other options to see Ukraine, and that may actually include different relations with Russia. And for Ukrainian government, it's extremely difficult to suggest anything, because there are completely different interests that drive the people in the Ukrainian government, and it's more about pressure and about pushes into the right direction. And one of the other things is EU support for the parts of Ukrainian civil society which are very, very, very nationalist, and even like presenting a liberal image, they have a very specific nationalist agenda behind them, and that deteriorates the stability within Ukraine. But basically, the issue of recognition of Ukrainian diversity and more synthetic, more negotiable way of development, and the issue of Ukrainian stability at the same time, that should be based on a real solution for this diversity, this should be in the ground for any serious policy in Ukraine, and also a policy about Ukraine too.
Understood. Thanks very much. We've only got a few minutes left, so let's just go around the horn and get into the concrete of what can be done right now. Number one, Rodrich, in your view, what can Germany do right now to help the European Union develop the strategic vision and the political will necessary to ensure that the EU becomes capable of setting the terms of its relationship with Russia? You're on mute, Rodrich.
Yeah, thank you. I believe that the European Union needs to become a little bit more humble and decent regarding their own capabilities. But these capabilities should be put together. That means we need to balance, as Germany, the interests, the security interests of the Eastern European countries and the migration problems of the Southern European countries. So I see the role of Germany as a balancer. And then we only can balance if we also bring in credible capabilities. That means we should stick to the 2% goal in NATO and to a credible PESCO, not only at the weak end, but also at the stronger military end. Third remark, we need to strengthen the European structures in Brussels. So the control of the Commission must be better, the role of the European Parliament must be improved, and we Germans must be willing to hand over more responsibilities to Brussels and Strasbourg. But we have a constitutional court who is not accepting the role of the European Parliament due to the balance of the voters inside. But we can overcome this by political will. And then Germany should also be a little bit more decent in its demands for an energy policy being decarbonized, we should accept that the European Union member states have different ways to gain economic sustainability. We are all unified in an overall goal, but the way to achieve this goal should be left to the different member states, and we should be restrained a little bit from a kind of German hybris. And then I believe also other countries might align themselves with this position. Thank you.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. Maria, the association agreement and DCFTA with Ukraine have been portrayed as a quintessentially EU way of playing the game of geopolitics. But I'm wondering if the current crisis really does reveal the limits of an EU foreign policy that is rooted exclusively in trade and in norms. And of course, a European military power is still, despite recent progress, of course, in substantial dimensions, is still a long way away. So both over the short term and the long term, both in this crisis and over the longer term, what are your recommendations for the European Union to become more of a genuinely geopolitical actor beyond just trade and norms?
I think EU has an excellent strategy, open strategic autonomy that laid out capabilities that needs to be in place. And recently we saw rolling out of the anti-coercion instrument that is meant to fight all of these geo-economic influences from external powers. And here it comes to the question whether the EU is ready to speak the hard power, the language of power that it meant to speak. So far, we see the creation of plenty of capabilities, but whether the EU is ready to act bolder, swifter, and again, coming back to sanctions, we still see that the EU is again ununited, Germany is ununited, hence we see this key member state also doesn't drive the policy of EU on the sanctions front. So this needs to be fixed. And also this institutional weakness in terms of not being a unitary power and acting versus Russia, China, others who can swiftly roll out sanctions in one day, that obviously hampers the speediness. And the swift reaction when it comes to sanctions, you cannot schedule sanctions, right? You cannot put them in a calendar and say, we're going to discuss sanctions on January 24th. That will happen with the EU and Russia. Because swiftness, this is a key part of deterrence. And by delaying this swiftness, this answer, you kill part of the deterrence. The second part, I would like to say that EU has been doing excellent work on sanctions, analyzing sanctions on Russia, on other countries. So it would be great to have some contingency measures in place. So when something happens, you have a backup plan, you have planning ahead what vulnerabilities could be sanctions could be good to have in place while keeping the self-paying to a minimum. And again, comparing how Russia or China react, or even Belarus, despite their very minimal cloud, they're quite quick and quite, pinpointing the precise vulnerabilities that EU has. And the last one, I'll stop with this. The EU should reduce its own domestic vulnerabilities. Statecraft starts from within, right? How autonomous you are, how non-vulnerable you are to external pressures. And over the past 8 years, EU hasn't minimized its vulnerabilities, in particular in the energy sphere. And the current energy crisis has only exaggerated the vulnerabilities that are already in place. So it's hard to be bold when you're vulnerable at home.
Understood. Thank you so much. I'd just like to give the last word to Javier. It was just brought up by Maria that the anti-coercion instrument, for example, could be a significant tool in the EU's toolbox to enhance its geopolitical clout. But that conceivably could lead to a situation where the EU can throw its weight around more with China halfway across the world than it can on hard security issues in its own neighborhood. And its relationship with Russia will remain unresolved. So what does that say, in your view, about the nature of the European project itself, if it's unable to manage its own continent?
Two things. One, I think it's very important to construct a European Union is to act. action is fundamental. And remember that when we were doing at the beginning, in my time, some operations outside the European Union, peacekeeping, helping, etc., that was action. And action forces you to not to act, not to do things. It's the one of the most important elements to go down the road. Now, you want to go up, you have to have ideas and actions. Actions is fundamental. That is what keeps people together. And a manner of constructing the European Union is by acting together. That is I tell you a story about Sweden. The first time that we went to Africa, Sweden never had been into Africa militarily or civilly. Africa was very far from them. The moment they went to Africa to the first operation, they became so happy, so enrolled with the rest of the countries. I mean, it was never missed another operation in Africa, Sweden. We had Sweden always ready to go to Africa. So this is the sentiment that I have with action. It is not only on peacekeeping, maybe in other things, but acting together. If we do something in this negotiation in Minsk, and we have with the other format or with a new format, try to get everybody together behind. This is such an emotion for the citizens also. You know, the European citizens like to see the European Union acting, not only in fighting, and not only having dinners, not only having meetings, but acting, solving problems. And this is the first thing I want to say. And the second thing I want to say is to thank you. To thank you, Stephen, for inviting me. It's a very good session for me. I learn a lot. I listen to people very intelligent that have said very intelligent things, very normal, very straightforward, without trying to say what they don't want to say, etc. Very frank discussion. And I want to thank you all, and then in particular SEPS, because you really organize, as always, very interesting issues. Thank you very, very much. And Marie, thank you very much. Volodymyr, thank you very much. And Radvik, thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Javier, for
we'll be together again.
All this closing of the host. It was a pleasure to have you on, as indeed all the other panelists. And Zach, thank you very much for moderating. We'd like to also thank our audience for their active participation in the chat. Sorry, well, some of the questions actually that were posed were either responded to by some of our panelists or have been taken up in the debate by Zach as he went along. Apologies to those. Also, Majito, you'd raise your hand for not creating the opportunity to bring you in. We have taken note of all of your observations, very good ones, and hope to fold that into our ongoing research and indeed events in the future, as this story will ramble on for quite a while. And we need indeed, as you said, Javier, long-term game plan to deal with Russia and the shared/contested neighborhood with that. So thank you very much all for tuning in, and hope to see you next time.